Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Rick Tempchin. I'm the Senior Fellow at the Alliance to Save Energy and a Loan Executive from the Edison Electric Institute. We're here today to hear about some new research, some groundbreaking research titled Why Leave Savings on the Table? Commercial Industrial Lighting Lifetime and Peak Demand Savings Analysis. I say this is groundbreaking research. And we're going to provide some key recommendations at the end of this webinar, which should last about an hour. And we have research recommendations and also recommendations to policymakers and program designers. I don't want to pre-broadcast the recommendations, but I think you'll be very interested and excited about this groundbreaking research. We have, in addition to myself, we have two other presenters today. Joining me on the webinar are Tina Halfpenny and Dan Mellinger. Tina is the Executive Director and CEO of the Design Lights Consortium. DLC is a nonprofit organization. They accelerate widespread adoption of high-performing commercial lighting solutions. Tina established the DLC as an independent nonprofit over a decade ago with the mission to drive efficiency through lighting. Dan Mellinger is the senior consultant at Energy Futures Group. EFG is an energy consultancy specializing in design and evaluation of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other clean energy programs and policies. Dan specializes in lighting technologies, and if I can say, the brains behind this whole operation. Next slide. For the agenda today, like I said, it's going to last an hour. We have a team of folks that work with us on this, a really interesting and important team of people. In addition to Dan and Tina, we have Jeremy Yan, current by GE, and my colleague Laura Van Wee from Alliance to Save Energy, and a number of other folks. Next slide, please. Just to give you some background on how we got here, this is part of our Systems Efficiency Resource Hub, the Alliance to Save Energy's multi-year program. And this report, like I said, in addition to the Design Lights Consortium and Energy Futures Group, we have Current Powered by GE as a key part of the team. And this Energy Efficiency Resource Hub that we've put together is a platform of case studies, reports, and tools designed to support building systems efficiency. And systems efficiency, you're going to hear a lot about that today, and you'll very quickly see why. And this initiative that we started back in 2015 involved a coalition of more than 100 partners, utilities, ESCOs, manufacturers, architects, government agencies, efficiency advocates, and we developed dozens of recommendations for moving the U.S. market forward towards a systems approach to energy efficiency. And the recommendations addressed ways to move beyond component level efficiency in buildings and improve energy efficiency, the whole building system. Let's call this beyond widgets, right? And we looked at a number of opportunities, including multiple buildings and also building to grid interaction. So you'll hear a little bit about today about peak demand reduction as part of these lighting systems. And just to summarize these work streams under the Resource Hub that we've put together, first we've got case studies of lessons learned from utility-led programs that focus on systems efficiency. Second, we're facilitating dialogues between utilities and energy service companies to look at new ways to collaborate on systems-level efficiency programs, evolving utility programs to a systems approach. And finally, we've been working on this project. It demonstrates C&I lifetime energy savings and peak demand savings and lighting systems. So that brings us to today's webinar. I'm going to ask Tina Halfpenny to now talk about some of the precursor analysis that DLC carried out and some of the details for today's webinar.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Just a quick sort of flashback here. The DLC worked with Dan Mellinger on this report last year, about a year and a half ago at this point, to look at the energy savings potential of network lighting. And what we were really trying to do is better understand the persistence of lighting savings in the commercial space. So we looked at that with in light of adoption trends, and then we packed on network lighting controls to really understand what the risk of lost opportunity is. As we, as we're a part of the efficiency community who's really kind of driving lighting retrofits across the country and Canada right now. So this was the original paper, and a lot of the data that Dan will speak to today was found in this original paper. So just a quick sort of housekeeping notes before we dive into the subject matter. This webinar will be recorded. It will be available on the DLC website. Any questions that you have, I will be managing the question pane, so write them in, and I will either stop Dan during the webinar and ask him the question, or we can hold them until the end. If sort of we've moved on from that topic, we will pick it back up during the Q&A session. So all the phones will be muted. A lot of times there's just general background noise. However, we will be monitoring the questions as they come in. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Dan.
All right, thank you, Tina, and thank you, Rick. Hello to everyone. My name is Dan Mellinger, as Rick said. I'm a senior consultant with Energy Futures Group, and this was an exciting project to work on in collaboration with Alliance to Save Energy, DLC, and GE Current. And I'm pleased to be here today to share the results of the project on commercial and industrial lighting, lifetime savings and peak demand savings. So let's jump right in. First, I want to go over some of the objectives. We were aiming to build on the 2018 DLC research, as Tina mentioned, and frame the potential in terms of lifetime energy savings to better reflect the economic and environmental benefits that these technologies can provide. If lifetime savings is not something familiar to you, don't worry, I'm going to go through what the definitions are of lifetime savings and peak demand savings for that matter. In order to understand the lifetime savings potential and peak demand savings potential, we needed to identify the various program assumptions used by energy efficiency programs for LED and network lighting control measures. And armed with these program assumptions, the research also aimed to quantify the peak demand savings potential of C&I lighting. And that's not something that other research projects have considered yet. And it was very insightful, the results that were identified. Finally, we wanted to evaluate the cost effectiveness of LED and network lighting controls as standalone measures, which is the current convention, the current approach that EE programs or energy efficiency programs take when evaluating cost effectiveness, and compare that against the cost effectiveness of LED and network lighting controls as a system measure. All right, so the 2018 DLC report and analysis served as a foundation for this research project. And that report was relied on some resources from the Department of Energy, the U.S. Lighting Market Characterization, and the Energy Savings Forecast of Solid State Lighting, as well as the DLC's Energy Savings from Network Lighting Control Systems report. So with the foundation of the DLC report, we needed to pair that with the energy efficiency program assumptions. And those were captured from 12 different technical reference manuals, or TRMs. We sampled TRMs from a number of different states and regions, and I'll go into that in just a minute. So these resources combined provided the necessary inputs for the lifetime savings and peak demand savings analysis that we're going to cover today. So the technical reference manual is a document or sometimes even a database in which the algorithms and assumptions are defined to calculate energy savings for common products and technologies. These TRMs also establish the conditions for a cost effectiveness calculation. Now, typically a TRM is a statewide resource that is approved by a regulatory body like a Public Utility Commission or PUC. Although there are some TRMs that cover a multi-state region. And for our research project, we reviewed 12 publicly available TRMs from a geographically diverse set of EE programs. Now, as shown here, we selected 3 from the Northeast, including one that is a multi-state resource, the Mid-Atlantic TRM, 4 from the Midwest, 3 from the South, and 2 from the West. Now, from each of these TRMs, we collected a number of values or assumptions associated with commercial and industrial lighting. The most important factors that we collected were measure lifetime and summer coincidence factor, and those 2 assumptions that you'll find in a TRM are directly related to the lifetime savings potential that an EE program could claim and the associated summer peak demand savings. I'm going to get into those in detail in a little bit. The TRMs that we reviewed were the most recently available copy at the time of the research, ranging from 2016 to 2019, as shown in that 3rd column, the version number. TRMs are updated sometimes annually. More often it's periodically according to a program cycle, so it might be a 2 or 3 year program cycle. And sometimes TRMs are updated very infrequently. But the versions that were reflected here were the most recently available at the time of the research. The LED fixtures and lamp measures evaluated are shown here, all representative of primary measures from commercial and industrial lighting. Of course, there are other measures, but many of them are more niche-based, and we wanted to focus on the highest volume, highest impact measures. As well as lighting controls, traditional controls being occupancy sensors and daylight sensors, as well as more recent developments of sensors that can do both occupancy and daylight, a dual sensor, and network lighting controls. Now, as you can see towards the bottom, the LED fixture and lamp measures were reflected in a high percentage or high number of the TRMs that we reviewed. Often 11 or even all of the TRMs reflected the measures that we were looking at. But and for traditional lighting controls, the same is the case. Occupancy sensors and daylight sensors, all of the TRMs reviewed reflected those measures. Fewer TRMs included a measure for a dual occupancy and daylight sensor, and only 1/3 of the TRMs reviewed included a measure for network lighting controls. Now, this is a very important point since network lighting controls are a technology that is key to maximizing the long-term savings potential. Next, we looked at measure lifetime. In the context of a TRM or an EE program assumption, measure lifetime describes the median length of time for which a measure is functional and energy savings can be counted by an energy efficiency program. So this could be different from a technical lifetime or functional lifetime, since it can be affected by things like codes and standards, which would prevent the savings from being attributable to an EE program. Measure lifetime in the context of energy efficiency programs and TRMs doesn't always mean the same thing as a technical or functional lifetime. Measure lifetime is used in calculating the cost effectiveness to ensure that the benefits of a measure, including the energy savings over the useful life, outweigh the costs before a measure can be included in a program portfolio. Now, as shown here, the measure lifetimes for indoor LED fixtures average approximately 15 years, although there are some programs that claim as few as 10 years for the measure life. The green shaded area represents the range of values identified in the TRM research, and the blue line represents the average value. Most of the TRM sampled use the DLC requirement for lumen maintenance of L sub 70 at 50,000 hours as a proxy for lifetime. It's the best thing we have available currently to evaluate lifetime, although it's not perfect. Traditional lighting controls, occupancy sensors, and daylight sensors have a measure lifetime of 8 to 10 years in the TRMs. Now, past studies have found that these devices really struggle to achieve a longer lifetime comparable to the LED lighting equipment, since they're often removed or disabled prematurely due to poor performance. And most people can relate to an occupancy sensor turning off on you and having to wave your hands, or maybe a daylight dimming system that didn't quite operate as expected. And so a lot of times these systems would be overridden by a facility manager or building occupant, which would shorten the useful life, effective useful life that energy savings could be claimed. The TRMs that do include a network lighting control measure also assume a shorter measure life compared to the LED lighting with which they're associated, even though network lighting controls and LED lighting increasingly operate as a system. So as shown here, the network lighting controls on average assume a measure lifetime of 11.5 years compared to something like nearly 15 years for an LED Troffer. I'll be discussing the ramifications of this assumption a little bit later. In terms of operating hours, the assumptions used shown here are used by EE programs when the actual operating hours are either not provided or not known. So sometimes a program will use what are called deemed operating hours, such as the figures that you see here, if the program either isn't aware of the actual facility operating hours or there's no mechanism to collect that information. These TRM values represent the daily operating hours for the space types most likely to be associated with each product type. Operating hours are defined according to space type, not necessarily a product type. And so a correlation needed to be created for the purpose of this research. So for LED Troffers, those were assumed to be going into offices. LED Higbay assumed to be associated with warehouses, and screw-based LED with retail. One thing worth noting here is the high degree of variability among programs with operating hours ranging from 6.7 hours per day up to 12.2 for Troffers. This is surprising since most of these Troffers are associated with an office type of space, and offices tend to have consistent operating hours regardless of the state or region. And so programs are assuming significantly different operating hour assumptions based on different reasons, rationale, or evaluations. And that has a direct relationship with the energy savings that are claimed, whether that's annual first-year energy savings or lifetime energy savings. Finally, in terms of the TRM research, I want to cover control savings factor. So the TRMs include a value for accounting for the savings that come from lighting controls as a percentage of full load hours, and that's done through something called a control saving factor. The savings factor may represent reduced operating hours, such as an occupancy sensor that turns off the lights, or it could reflect a reduced light level, either through daylight dimming or high-end trim, something like that, or both. So the savings factor is intended to represent all of the savings that can come from the lighting control measure. Among the programs that do include a network lighting control measure, all of them reference the DLC network lighting control specification for product qualification, and they use the 47% savings estimate identified by previous DLC research completed in 2017. So to summarize the key findings from the TRM research, at the highest level, it appears that TRMs are not keeping pace with lighting control technology, and the most glaring issue being that network lighting controls are not reflected in a majority of the TRMs, 2/3. Now, that doesn't mean that a program can't support network lighting controls. Far from it. They could still support or provide incentives for network lighting controls through a custom or calculated program. But if we hope to reach the scale and volume necessary to realize the maximum savings potential, EE programs will need multiple avenues through which network lighting controls can be promoted, and they can't do that without a TRM measure. So a TRM measure will enable them to offer prescriptive midstream rebates or upstream rebates in parallel with or in addition to a custom or calculated program. And that's really important to reach scale. There is one additional area of TRM research that we looked at, and that's the summer peak coincidence, but I'll be addressing that specifically when I cover the peak demand topic. Okay, I'm going to move on to lifetime savings unless any questions have come up. Anything you want to address, Tina?
Good to go, Dan.
All right, great, thanks. So to make sure everyone's on the same page, I'm going to start with some brief definitions for lifetime savings potential. Most energy efficiency programs track progress in terms of annual first-year energy savings. This value represents the 12-month total expected by a measure in its first year of implementation. And it actually doesn't matter at what point in the year a measure is installed. A measure that's installed in January or November is going to be credited the same 12-month total of energy savings that would be expected in its first year of operation. That's the most common way that utilities track energy savings. Unfortunately, focusing on first-year savings can result in incentives that are directed toward measures that they may have good initial savings, but a shorter lifetime, instead of measures that have a greater lifetime benefit. So lifetime savings, on the other hand, represents the sum of a measure's annual savings over its expected useful life. So this is where the measure lifetimes identified in that TRM research come into play. If you have a measure that is expected to save 100 kilowatt hours in its first year and has a 5-year measure life, the lifetime savings would be 500 kilowatt hours. Measures can have vastly different measure lifetimes and, of course, annual savings, and so the total lifetime impact of a measure can vary greatly. And since most measures last longer than 1 year, a lifetime savings metric more adequately represents the energy and economic potential of a measure. Well, if lifetime savings is a better metric, then why do energy efficiency programs continue to rely on first-year savings? So all energy efficiency programs consider the product lifetime, and in fact, peak demand savings as well, when evaluating cost effectiveness. In order for a measure to be considered cost-effective and included in the portfolio, it has to pass a cost-effectiveness test, which includes that product lifetime. However, the program plans and incentive offers are almost universally designed around first-year energy savings. And as a result, this bias that I was just mentioning can be created toward measures with a lower first-year cost, regardless of the product lifetime. Now, the reasons for this are generally simplicity and historical precedents. While the energy savings in the first year can be calculated with a high degree of confidence, predicting a measure's useful life is much more difficult. And so attributing lifetime savings is that much more challenging than attributing savings associated with a measure's first year. Also, and perhaps most importantly, many state policies such as an energy efficiency resource standard, or EERS, rely on first-year savings rather than lifetime. And this map, published by ACEEE in a report earlier this year on lifetime savings, it highlighted that of the states that have an EERS 27, 25 of them rely on first-year energy savings. So the vast majority rely on first-year energy savings. And if it is in a state policy, an energy efficiency program has to track progress against first-year energy savings. So much of this situation is rooted in the policies that already exist. Now, there are some states that have increased their focus on lifetime savings, either through goals or performance incentives tied to lifetime benefits. A handful of examples shown here. But still, first-year energy savings remains the most common and prevalent approach, followed by energy efficiency programs. As we mentioned previously, the 2008 research by the DLC identified that network lighting controls represent a significant amount of the remaining potential C&I lighting savings, as shown on this chart in green. However, this potential is really underrepresented by the reliance on first-year energy savings. This chart is done so in terms of annual or first-year savings in the year in which the measure is implemented. But as we've discussed, since these measures can last many years, often 10 to 15 years, the annual savings metric ignores a majority of the potential benefit. Now, if all commercial and industrial lighting has a similar lifetime, when evaluating just within a C&I lighting realm, that's fine. But once we start evaluating measures within a portfolio against other technologies that have varying lifetimes, it becomes much more important to consider the lifetime savings potential as opposed to first year. So in order to understand the lifetime savings potential, the analysis, the project aimed to better quantify the savings potential that was identified in the DLC research. The key inputs and assumptions of the analysis are shown here. And the top 4 sections, which I've just put on the screen, are all consistent with the prior DLC research, although some revisions were made to account for the additional year of adoption that has occurred since the DLC research last took place. Finally, the measure lifetimes from the TRM research are included in order to quantify measure lifetime. All right. So the resulting lifetime savings are shown here, and the chart on the left is contrasting the lifetime savings against the annual first-year savings. The light gray is showing the cumulative annual savings that were identified in the prior DLC research between 2020 and 2035, and the dark gray is showing the cumulative lifetime benefit between those same time periods for the measures. The lifetime savings potential is an order of magnitude larger than the typical tracking and reporting convention of the first year savings, since it accounts for those savings over the entire measure life. And in terms of the total savings, network lighting controls in the pie graph on the right represent a full quarter of the remaining lifetime savings potential, 886 terawatt hours. Importantly, the lifetime savings calculations are based on the TRM research findings shown here. The TRMs all treat the LED products and the network lighting controls as separate measures with different assumptions for measure lifetime. The values shown here represent the averages identified across all of those TRMs. 3 of the TRMs that contained a network lighting control measure used a lifetime that was aligned with the traditional lighting controls, that kind of 8 to 10 year range for things like occupancy sensors and daylight sensors. But if LEDs and network lighting controls are dependent on each other to achieve savings, is it reasonable to apply a shorter lifetime to network lighting controls? And I would argue no, since the LED products and network lighting controls they increasingly operate as a system. And in fact, some cases they're entirely inseparable. There are many reasons to justify a longer lifetime for network lighting controls. There are things like much greater sensor coverage due to lower sensor costs, integration with luminaires, sensor miniaturization, and wireless technology. All of these reasons have, realities have enabled sensors to be installed with a much greater level of coverage and granularity, and that improves the operation, increases sensor redundancy, and minimizes blind spots. This poor operation was really a key issue, or poor performance was a key issue that led to the traditional lighting controls being disabled. And that's less of an issue with network lighting controls. There's also the fact that LEDs offer much greater dimming performance compared to a control system paired with fluorescent. Multifunction sensors, which can improve detection, are increasingly available on network lighting control systems. These NLC systems can be custom grouped and zoned instead of hardwired. And the settings like occupancy sensor timeout, daylight dimming thresholds, they can be fine-tuned through software as opposed to really inconvenient dials or switches on the device itself. So therefore, for the purpose of this analysis, the network lighting control measures were adjusted to align to the LED measure lifetime with which the controls are associated. So those values are shown here. Instead of using 11.5 years across the board for network lighting controls, the assumed measure lifetime was aligned with the product type, the LED product type that it's associated. So 14.8 years for a Higbay, or 14.5 years for a Troffer, et cetera. With an adjusted network lighting control lifetime, the lifetime savings increases by 22%, and the share of remaining lifetime savings increases from 25% up to 29%, representing nearly a third of the remaining potential. These adjusted savings values may represent a more realistic estimate of LED and network lighting controls operating as a system. The cumulative lifetime benefit of a network lighting control measure nearly equals that of outdoor LED products, but there's a really important distinction. Outdoor LED lighting is at or near the midpoint of adoption, while network lighting controls are still scaling up. And this is a very critical point for energy efficiency programs to consider when designing programs and incentive offers that can stimulate market transformation. At a more granular product level, the most significant lifetime savings potential lies within the linear lamp and fixture product category. This is consistent with the prior DLC research, and so not necessarily a surprise, but it's worth noting nonetheless. And network lighting controls can offer savings on top of any of these product types, but the linear category is certainly the most significant. All right, that wraps up our section on lifetime savings. I'm going to pause to grab a quick drink before I move on to peak demand savings. So Tina, chime in if there's any questions you want to address.
Okay, so hydrate, I'm going to read this. How do network lighting controls measures address energy used from lighting powered by personal workstations? And could be task lighting, but could be other integrated with building systems?
Yeah, this analysis didn't consider that type of feature or benefit, but it's entirely possible that network lighting controls can be integrated with the lighting that is the personal lighting that is delivered at a desk or a workstation. Because they're networked, they can communicate with devices, any connected device. Traditionally, they're associated with the lighting in the ceiling, but it's entirely plausible that it can be associated with personal lighting control. But again, this analysis didn't specifically look at that factor.
Okay, I've got one more. And it's funny because I've had a couple of flavors of this same question pinged to me via text message as well. How do we get past evaluators simply using the DLC minimum lifetime hours divided by operating hours to determine EULs?
Yeah, right. So I made that, I maybe I've glossed over that point, but I mentioned that many of the TRMs and therefore the EE programs rely on that 50,000 hour minimum requirement as a proxy for measure lifetime. And so if you take 50,000 hours and if your annual operating hours for a measure is assumed to be 5,000 hours for easy math, your measure life, your effective useful life, EUL, is going to be 10 years. But of course, that's the minimum requirement. And it's not unlike the issue that exists with efficacy. The requirements published by the DLC are minimum performance requirements for efficacy, but many products achieve over and above that level. What most programs have done from the efficacy standpoint, but have not seen it done on a lifetime standpoint, is they use the product mean or average from a specific category to calculate efficacy or power in the context of a TRM. So if you're looking at LED Troffers and the efficacy requirement is 100 lumens per watt, the minimum, you might establish a program assumption in a TRM that doesn't use that 100 lumen per watt requirement, but instead uses the average of qualified products in the category. You could do the same thing with product lifetime, although I don't recall if that information is shown in the QPL, but it can be accessed and could be used to develop a more realistic assumption of lifetime. But again, those values only represent lumen maintenance, and they're not, it's not a perfect proxy for functional or effective life.
Okay, if we get any more questions, I will let you know.
Okay, so let's move on to peak demand savings. And this is a very different concept than lifetime savings, but just as, if not more, important. So again, I'm going to start with some definitions to get everyone on the same page. So there are three primary components to measuring electricity, and that's consumption, demand, and peak demand. Consumption represents the power used over time, and it's measured in kilowatt hours, also called energy. This is shown in the graph, the shaded area of the graph. Demand represents the instantaneous power requirement measured in kilowatts, and it's shown as the blue line on the graph. So the power demand will vary over the course of the day. That's what the graph is showing. And the consumption or energy is the sum of everything under that blue curve, all of the power over time. Peak demand is the highest power demand during a time frame, such as a day, shown here in the graph, but it could be a month, a season, or a year. And savings associated with peak demand often reflect the most important grid system impacts expected from a measure, since energy produced and purchased at the time of system peak is typically the most expensive due to supply constraints. And further, the additional energy required to meet a peak demand often comes from the least clean power sources, such as an oil or gas peaker power plant. Therefore, the measures that reduce peak demand can have profoundly positive economic and environmental benefits. The extent to which an energy efficiency measure overlaps with peak demand is called coincidence. Coincidence factors are defined for each measure in the TRM, and they're used to estimate the impact that a measure has on peak demand for an associated season, typically summer and winter. So here are some examples from the Massachusetts TRM for various lighting measures in summer and winter. And in terms of peak, in terms of summer peak, the commercial indoor lighting has the most significant impact among lighting measures, unless you're accounting for something like continuous industrial lighting. Of course, something that's running continuously is going to have 100% coincident with system peak. It doesn't matter when that peak occurs. If the measure is always operating, it's going to overlap with that peak. But commercial indoor lighting, at least Massachusetts says it's 83% coincident with the summer peak time frame. And so that could mean that not all of the lighting is operating during the peak time frame, or the general operating hours of the facilities are a little bit outside of that peak time frame. Looking at outdoor lighting, something like an LED street light, they save energy during the night, and if summer peak typically occurs during the afternoon, the energy savings from an LED street light is unlikely to have any impact on summer peak demand. So Massachusetts, just like most other programs, attribute a 0% coincidence factor for outdoor lighting in terms of summer peak. Not the case for winter, however. It gets dark depressingly early in the Northeast, and as such, the outdoor lighting is 100% coincident with the winter peak, which occurs between 5 and 7 p.m. For the peak demand analysis, the summer peak was selected since most utilities face a greater capacity constraint during the summer. And most of the TRMs reviewed define the summer peak time period as late afternoon weekdays, June through August, although that specific time of day can vary a little bit. The coincidence factors identified from the TRM research are shown here. Again, these factors represent the overlap of an energy efficiency measure with the summer peak time frame of being late afternoon, Monday through Friday, June through August. The indoor lighting fixtures, something like an LED Troffer, on average have 68% coincidence with the summer peak time frame. Although there's significant variation among the fixtures, and even more so among the lighting controls. The variation means that the same lighting measure could have drastically different assumed peak demand impacts from one state to the next, even though most of the states assume a very similar system peak time frame. And then lastly, among lighting controls, network lighting controls have the highest assumed coincidence factor at 74%. This graph shows the results of the peak demand analysis. Light blue represents the full demand savings, and dark blue represents the peak demand savings according to those coincidence factors that we were just looking at. So in the context of summer peak, indoor LED lighting and network lighting controls are far and away the most important commercial lighting measures. And the best way to achieve both of these measures is to promote LED and network lighting controls as a system. A program that relies on separate measures is bound to strand the savings potential when LED is installed absent lighting controls. To put the savings in context, by 2035, the total peak demand savings could equal roughly 5% of the entire US fleet of fossil fuel-based power plants based on their rated capacity in 2017. This level of savings is therefore incredibly significant, but it's dependent on utilities and industry at large being able to realize the high levels of adoption forecasted for LED and network lighting controls. This level won't be achieved if we only accomplish LED alone. All right, cost effectiveness. The last section of the research I'm going to cover is cost effectiveness, and the goal was to evaluate the cost effectiveness of LED and network lighting controls as standalone measures and as a system. We evaluated a number of different cost effectiveness related metrics associated with the customer economics and energy efficiency program incentive economics. Importantly, this analysis was not considering cost effectiveness from the standpoint of portfolio evaluation and avoided cost. That's a much more complicated process, and it varies from one state or one jurisdiction to another. There's no standard or consistent approach for that calculation. But we can look at it consistently from a customer standpoint and an energy efficiency program standpoint. The scenarios considered here are shown along with the key inputs. Obviously, there are a lot of different outcomes that are possible based on the selected inputs, and this analysis was simply meant to represent a baseline or average condition in order to compare those scenarios of standalone measures with a system measure. When I present the charts on the following slides, I include text at the bottom to outline all the different assumptions that went into it, and additional information is available in the printed report. I just want to make it clear that I fully recognize that there are a lot of different scenarios that can be that can influence the cost effectiveness, and this is just one snapshot. So first, starting with LED Troffers, looking at customer economics in terms of net present value. NPV represents the total value to a customer over the life of the measured in today's dollars. And a system approach shown in green, which would combine LED with network lighting controls, maximizes the net present value and therefore the benefits to the customer. In terms of energy efficiency program cost, I used levelized cost to consider the cost of the investment against the lifetime savings discounted to today's dollars. Now, what this chart on the right is showing is that a system measure, again in green, represents a very similar levelized cost as an uncontrolled LED product, with most programs supporting and incentivizing uncontrolled LED. You can see at a very nominal additional cost, an energy efficiency program could deliver a system measure that maximizes savings and customer value. Looking at the same type of analysis for LED Higbay, we can see that similarly the first chart shows that a system-based measure will maximize the net present value customer benefits, in this case by a fairly significant margin. And then again, in terms of energy efficiency program cost, the levelized cost of an LED and network lighting control system is actually better than an uncontrolled LED. On this chart, the uncontrolled LED and the standalone network lighting control are flipped. And so the green system measure actually could improve the cost effectiveness of an incentive program for a system measure compared to an LED without controls. All right, I'm going to wrap up here to leave some time for Q&A. I'm going to quickly go through our summary findings and recommendations, and then we'll open it up for questions. I've already hit on most of these key points, but the main themes are really the important thing to understand. The TRM program assumptions need to evolve to keep pace with technology and enable maximum energy savings potential. The lifetime savings should be emphasized by program designers and policymakers. A system approach is a preferred path for promoting LED and network lighting controls in terms of savings potential, customer value, and utility incentive cost. And the peak demand potential savings are significant, should be accounted for, and really need to be evaluated in comparison to other measures in the portfolio. So the research recommendations, lifetime savings. We'd like to see the programs, regulators, and policymakers increase the focus on lifetime savings. A measure characterization for network lighting controls is first and foremost needed within all TRMs, and the lifetime associated with that measure should, at a minimum, be consistent with the LED fixtures. Ideally, the characterization in a TRM would be a systems-based approach, where network lighting controls and LED are a single measure. And the programs could then develop incentive strategies to promote these products as a complete system. Desired outcomes being the better representation, improved representation of the impacts of our programs and policies. A system measure is going to minimize the cost effectiveness challenges while maximizing the true lifetime and peak savings potential. Ideally, we would maximize network lighting control adoption and thereby limit the stranded savings. Every LED that's installed without network lighting controls or controls of any sort strands those deeper savings potential. Network lighting controls will enable integration with other building systems and really establish a foundation for grid interactive efficient buildings. All right, that's a wrap from my standpoint. Tina, I'll let you cover any questions that have come in.
Thanks, Dan. We don't have any other questions. I just want to validate one. Oh, actually, that's not true. We do have another question in there. Ooh, that's a big one. But someone did ask earlier in the question pane if the lifetime savings versus the first year annual savings was just a lighting issue, or was it across technologies? And I answered it is an issue across technologies.
Absolutely. Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
We're focusing on it from the standpoint of CNI lighting. That was our goal and intent here, but the issue is much broader than that. We've quantified the potential for CNI lighting because these measures, which is important because these measures have a long lifetime. And the issue affects an entire portfolio. And what we don't want to see is CNI lighting de-emphasized in favor of other measures that might have good first-year savings, but a shorter measure lifetime. And that's what a policy built around lifetime savings can help avoid.
Okay, I am going to see if we can answer one of these questions offline with respect to, or the one related to effective useful life. And moving on to another question, is there a calculator based on this study and parameters that can be used to simplify the benefit expectations to customers?
The benefit expectation, I'm guessing that is looking at something like net present value, payback, internal rate of return. Those are all things that we evaluated.
Well, I think does the peak go into benefits too?
Sure, of course. Yep. I was interpreting the question from an economic standpoint, but system peak benefits can deliver savings to a customer depending on the type of electric rate that they have. Avoiding or minimizing peak demand charges can be a very advantageous thing for a customer in terms of economics.
Okay, I think this is the last one. How was aggregate demand savings analyzed? Is that for a specific building type or across all buildings?
Could you, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that one. Could you say it again?
How was the aggregate demand savings analyzed? Maybe, is that for a specific building type or across all buildings?
So in terms of demand savings, the building type doesn't factor in. What I believe the question is getting at is the fact that there's a higher demand savings potential than the peak demand savings. And that is calculated based on the TRM definitions for the baseline power and the LED power. Operating hours don't factor into the demand analysis. And the resulting peak demand savings figure is a subset of that because of the coincidence factor. But the building type doesn't factor in to the demand calculation. It does once we start to talk about energy savings because the building type will often prescribe the operating hours.
Okay, these are rolling in, so I am not reading them in advance. Can you address the synergy? Can you address the synergy of network lighting controls with demand response programs via curtailment of a non-seasonal load such as interior lighting, presumably the economic?
Yeah, I can. And first, actually, I'm glad this came up. I didn't mention it here in the webinar, and it is mentioned briefly in the report. But when we're talking about peak demand savings from these energy efficient measures, it is entirely different than a demand response program. Demand response is a very intentional action or activity that is taken to reduce the power at or near a time of system peak, generally for economic purposes. So a customer could be on a special rate where they receive a signal from the utility to lower their power consumption, their power demand at a certain time frame, and they get an economic benefit as a result. That's very different than the peak demand savings that we're talking about here that occur naturally as a result of a measure being installed. In other words, the customer doesn't need to take a specific action in order to enable or unlock these peak demand savings. But demand response is an important, very important tool in managing the grid loads, and network lighting controls can enable demand response actions because it is a connected device. Now, one possible avenue is using the network lighting controls to simply adjust lower the light levels at the time of system peak. However, I would argue, I haven't quantified this in terms of an analysis, but I would argue that benefit is rather slim since at the time of system peak, at least in the context of a summer peak, it's likely that the lighting will already be dimmed to some extent from a daylight dimming system, and the baseline technology, if it's a network lighting control system, is going to be LED. So there's not a whole lot left for a demand response program from a lighting standpoint. However, a network lighting control has the capability to integrate with a building management system, a BMS, through something like BACnet, and therefore could enable demand response through the connected lighting to control things like HVAC set points, ventilation rates, et cetera, which could really unlock some significant peak demand influences through a demand response program.
Okay. I'm going to see if we can fit in two more here. Would you recommend increasing the lifetime of standalone sensors?
At this point, I would say no. There have been several evaluations that have documented the challenge with standalone sensors. The issue is that newer generation of sensors can have better performance, and sensors can be installed more granularly. So there is a potential argument to be made for looking at the lifetime of, let's say, occupancy sensors alone. But from a program standpoint, it's really difficult to know whether the occupancy sensor being installed is a traditional sensor that's going to be installed one per room, or if it's something different. Where I might suggest the lifetime could be differentiated would be for integral controls. I think there's a pretty strong justification that a integral control, luminaire level lighting control, even if it's just occupancy sensors, could and should have a longer lifetime.
Okay, I'm wondering if you just answered that. Does the expected useful life change for LLC systems versus separate NLC sensors?
Yeah, it does. And aside from just the point of being more sensors, providing that more granular level of control and fewer blind spots, the devices are inseparable. By definition, they're luminaire level, they're integrated. And so to suggest that the controls associated with that lighting has a different measure life, I think is inaccurate.
Okay. Well, we're right at 2 o'clock. Thank you, Dan and Jeremy and Rick and Laura. We are going to conclude the webinar for today. You can listen to this recording as well as read through the report. You can find them on the ESC website or the DLC website. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks all.